What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of HR Heretics. Valentina, welcome to the show.
So great to be here. I'm excited for a spicy chat.
Well, let's get right into that. And I will actually start with saying Kelly's not here. It's 7:40 Pacific time. She usually sleeps until about 9. She did confirm this. So all we can assume is that Kelly's asleep, and I will roast her all day long for missing this conversation. So thanks again for showing up, even if it's just for me.
I appreciate it, and I'm happy to show up just for you.
Love it. Okay. So you were at Bridgewater for 5 years. I have been a Bridgewater fanboy, at least from afar. I've read Principles. I've read all the crazy things that Ray does. And what I find most interesting about that culture is it's highly experimental with people operations. So some radical things that they did at Bridgewater, as I read in Principles, is like record every meeting, like literally of every single meeting in the company. They rate team members' performance during meetings. I think Ray called it like the dot collector. Tell us about your time at Bridgewater and about some of these experiments and what it was actually like living those.
Yeah. So I'll just say, there are many things that Bridgewater did excellently from a people experiments perspective, and many things that were not so excellent. I'll just say at the highest level before I get into kind of the tactics. I think from a people experiments perspective, I think Bridgewater really pioneered an audaciously high bar for talent, which is something that I've taken away and believe is like that's a principle I will always go by, especially for leaders. Candor is not an option. That's not Bridgewater. Those aren't Ray's words. Those are mine. But I don't believe you can choose to have a culture that's not candid and still have high performance. And finally, once you have all these big talents, you have to give them autonomy and let them run a business, whatever that business is. If that business is TA, that's their business with their KPIs and they're running it autonomously. And so I think Bridgewater did those things excellently and had some really great people philosophies that drove that. Those same people philosophies or similar ones also drove a lot of interesting practices, some of which were great and some of which were not as great. And so talking about, for example, the dot collector specifically, the dot collector was founded on both great management people ops thinking and I think flawed management people ops thinking. So we did, in fact, in every meeting and at the end of every day, rate people on their performance across a set of 120 attributes. It started off as thumbs up, thumbs down with a thoughtful feedback, and then it became a scale of 1 to 10 with a thoughtful feedback. Now, that I actually think is a good tool. Particularly if it were based on competencies, it wasn't. It was based on attributes. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But imagine you had a tool where you had your competency grid, and there are tools like this. And in relatively real time, you could be like, hey, Valentina, in this meeting, I thought that you shined or fell short on the competency of team design because your org structure that you described didn't make a lot of sense. And here's the feedback that I would have for you and the advice I would have for you. Totally stand behind that. I think that's great. And I really enjoyed that aspect of DOTS. And that's all based on the principles of feedback and transparency. There was another principle of systemized management where the idea was you take all of this data and you use it to paint a pointillistic picture of people over time. And over that, you apply AI and you use all of that to not substitute, but significantly augment human judgment in terms of putting people into roles who should be elevated, who doesn't have what it takes. And so I think that's where that doesn't work for a couple of reasons. One, it's all based on an inherently flawed system where we weren't rating people on competencies. We were rating them on 120 attributes that are kind of fixed. So it wasn't like, hey, Valentina, let me help you get better. It was, hey, Valentina, I'm going to tell you where I think your logical thinking is. This is how good of a logical thinker I think you are. And so it was these fixed attributes. And inherently, there's so much bias in that, right? Especially in a company that is preponderantly led by white men. And so if you take this system where all the data has this inherent bias in it, and then you use it to help manage people, you are creating something that is fundamentally very flawed.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to go back to dot collector, and then I want to come back to what you just said. So for dot collector, what was the experience like receiving that? So again, as I understand it, I have not seen this tool. I know only a couple of companies, to my understanding, have actually toyed around with the dot collector once it was productized. But you get feedback in a meeting, and then you get feedback at the end of the day. Like, what does it look like? So you open the thing up, and when do you open that thing up, and what are you reading, and what is that like?
Yeah, so it's kind of mind-boggling. It's imagine, that moment in reviews and you're opening your 360 feedback and you're like, "Oh my God, what are people saying about me?" Every minute of every day. So you become a little desensitized to it on the plus side. And then there's a benefit to it, of course. Like that 360 feedback is rich and it gives you all of this stuff to process and think about and change. Now, the question is, how much can you change? How much feedback can you process in a given day? And so, yeah, like at the end of the day, if I had a public day where I was leading a lot of meetings, I would sit down and be like, all right, I got 25 dots. Let's see where I'm at. And you would read like thoughtful feedbacks from people saying things like, thumbs up, Valentina, you visualized that meeting really well and drove it through to results, at all the way to like thumbs down on conceptual thinking from Ray. And then you're like, oh, well, now I will be an idiot in the system for all time.
Wow. Okay. But you record the meetings. And so actually, like, I have to ask this question first, which is there like a dot collector god? So like an overlord that sees like all the dots to make sure that the feedback is actually like thoughtful and constructive and specific?
That is a good question. I don't know what the answer to that is now, but I do know that everyone can see everyone else's dots. And I did see
Wow.
dotting on dots. So people would dot other people's dots and be like, hey, your dot was not very helpful, or like your dot was too aggressive. And then people would get in dot wars.
Okay. That's very meta and very interesting. Okay. So let's talk about this, what you just said around bias. And so let me just play it back that I have it correct, which is the AI tool to put people into roles was highly weighted by people who were already in senior positions. Thus, those people looked, mostly white, mostly men. And because that was the case, right, that system was inherently biased. Do I have that right?
I would say so. And, I think, now they have a superwoman at the helm and things may be radically different. I've been gone for a long time. But yeah, that is a fair characterization of looking backwards, how I would describe the attempt to systemize management.
Got it. Okay. Super helpful. And then why don't more people take like the best of what worked from there? Because again, my take on Bridgewater is they feel like they're on the cutting edge of people experimentation. Ray talks about this all the time. So none of this stuff is like state secrets. Like he actually wants to put it in the world, which I think is good for Bridgewater and good for his brand. Why do you think people aren't doing this?
Because it's hard. I would ask, how many leaders have principles on their shelves? I would say most, or at least more than 50%. And then how many are actually applying the practice, and how many read it and were like, oh my God, I feel like I'm discovering a truth. This is so the way I think. Yes. Right. And then they don't implement it because it's really, really hard. And that's my short answer.
Yeah, it makes total sense, right? Like getting to that level of clarity of what actually matters. It sounds very easy, but the reality is that like you don't just do it overnight. It's not like hey, like let's go lock ourselves in a conference room and come up with company values. Every time I've done this, it's been like a months long process. There's so much like churn and going through the ideas. Then you get something, you're like, I'm like 70% happy with it. Then it iterates like 12 times over the course of the next like year and a half. And then people are like, fuck, it's like not close enough. Like, I don't know what we want to do with this.
Let's start again.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So now you're at Garner, and Garner is Series C, 200 people. You guys are projecting to double year over year. Many tech companies are pushing employees back to the office, but you guys are committed to making remote work permanent. Why is that the case?
Well, I would say we're hybrid. So by hybrid, meaning some in-office employees, some fully remote employees. And we are committed to making that permanent. And I would say the same thing, or a similar thing to what I said about why people don't do principles, is the same reason why people are bringing folks in office, because it's easier. A lot of things are easier to do in office. And in order to get that ease, the trade-off is you have a narrower talent pool, and almost by definition, you will have worse talent in your company. And Garner is not willing to trade off the obvious bad outcome in exchange for doing the easier thing. Like, I would rather think through how to do culture and employee experience excellently. And I don't worry about productivity. Our people are very productive, but specifically culture and employee experience excellently in a remote environment. I will take that difficult trade-off and like solve the future of work eventually, God willing, than take a obvious bad outcome.
It's such an honest answer that I appreciate, because the reality of successful companies is all of them go some form of hybrid eventually, whether that's a second HQ, whether that's we have some remote employees, whether that's like, Coinbase, we could just go fully remote. And I appreciate the earnestness, because it is true that it is easier to manage in person. And that's kind of just like that, well, like, let's just not deal with this shit right now. But you're going to deal with it eventually if you are successful. And it appears that you guys are on that path. So what are you doing to make hybrid successful, especially given that what many people say about hybrid is it's the worst of all worlds?
Yeah. Well, what we're not doing, I think, yes, hybrid is very difficult. I think when some people say hybrid is the worst of all worlds, they are talking about the mandatory hybrid policies, but leading a team that is partly remote and partly in person is very difficult. So I'll say a few things. One, we appreciate the need for in-person connection. Like, we have a bespoke culture where we expect people to give us the best work of their lives, put the mission ahead of self-interest, give and receive honesty. And we understand that you can't do that without a deep reservoir of trust. And so we, both in the system and in the people, so we invest very heavily in in-person time, while people still get to live and work wherever they want. But we bring every remote employee gets at least 3 in-person touch points a year. 2 of them will involve seeing the CEO most likely. And so that's something we invest heavily in. And then, lots of ways for people to spend time in person is one piece of it. The other piece of it is actually identifying what is the difference. What are the moments that matter? What is the what, the when, the how that makes in-person culture, in-person employee experience better than remote? And identifying those moments and then teaching leaders how to deal with remote employees or hybrid teams in those moments.
It's really interesting. So 3 times a year we get together, and so I'm assuming what that means is there's probably like one big company retreat thing. And then there's like potentially, multiple moments specifically with the team and cross-functional team that you're building with whatever thing you're working on. Is that right?
Exactly.
The thing that's underneath that is a lot of people go remote for the arbitrage that you don't have to have an office. And so that makes it cheaper. And actually, I think what you guys are doing potentially might even be more expensive.
Absolutely. That's not why we're remote. We are all about excellence. I mean, yes, efficiency matters as well, but no, we're happy to pay real estate costs if our great New York talent, or in the future, maybe our great Silicon Valley talent, wants to be in the office. We'll give them that. And if our great, Utah talent can join Garner, we want them.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. Do you guys keep it right now to the continental US, or are you guys truly remote in the sense that we're looking global?
We have global employees.
Okay. I find that the time zone difference is insanely hard. And, when you're building, especially software, and people are, trying to move very quickly, you have these very large gaps of when you can get information that if you just had walking over to somebody at the water cooler, you'd be able to move faster. I find that fully remote global is hard from a synchronous standpoint. So for example, if I'm in California and I'm a product manager working with software engineers in New York and then even overseas, which is even more challenging, it's very difficult to actually get things done and to move quickly. How do you all defend against that?
Yeah. So we've been pretty strategic in terms of what we hire abroad, in that we build kind of distinct pods. We have a distinct pod, for example, in Hungary, of people who work closely together. And then besides that, we are mostly the continental US, and that makes it easier because there's 6 hours a day when everyone knows they have their synchronous time. And we use it. We have meetings. We're an asynchronous company. And then, there's actually a benefit to people having IC time at the bookends of the day, depending where they are. And so that's the way we manage it.
Yeah, I love the honesty around the benefit of IC time. Like I find that I become insanely unhappy when I don't have deep work time and everything is just synchronous. This is the thing that drives me crazy about only in office is like you're just constantly interrupted. And so getting deep work done actually requires me to be in like a different zone than the open office floor plan.
Totally.
Okay. So the other thing I want to ask you about is seniority. And I have a take that new grads specifically, or folks earlier in their career, have a very hard time learning remotely. And I don't think it's impossible, but I do think earlier in your career, I just reflect back on myself and other people I've talked to. I learned a ton from osmosis. And there's a lot of stuff that you just learn by just observing that you don't get the benefit of when you're not in office. So how do you all think about folks earlier in their career?
Yeah. So I think a couple things. First, did you start out as a recruiter, perchance?
I started out as a recruiting coordinator.
Yeah. So I think that there are some functions that are particularly apprenticeship driven, and they're relationship functions like sales, recruiting, account management. It's really hard to just teach someone how to have great client hands. Like they both need to observe and they need to be observed, right? And so we understand those types of relationships and those types of moments for people that are coming up early in their career and replicate those remotely. So for example, for our new recruiters, our head of TA spends a lot of time letting them learn from him. They shadow other recruiters. And then we do record a subset of our interviews and a subset of our meetings for training purposes, which is different from what Bridgewater did. And then Jason, our head of TA, will listen to those and give advice. And so it's another one of those of like, what is the what, when, and how that really mattered for those folks? And how can we replicate that asynchronously?
That makes total sense. I do want to talk about the recording, Jason recording stuff. So what does that look like? What is he actually doing?
So when we will occasionally record interviews, actually we record a fair amount of interviews for training purposes, and I can get into that in a bit. Part of the reason why we do that is because we have had so much growth, people coming from all over the place, and we have this incredibly high talent bar and a bespoke hiring process. And so we have two options, right? Just constantly be running rigorous interviewer training, which we have like a recorded scalable training that we put everyone through. But it's not like me constantly once a month in the room, like really grappling with people as to what a good interview does, as to what makes a good interviewer. And so both for the recruiters and our interviewers, we need to understand what people are doing so that we make sure that people are calibrated and we are actually getting the reads we want, bringing people into the company.
Hey everyone, we'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Your workforce is both your organization's greatest strength and largest single cost. With Planful, it's easy to unlock the secrets of successful workforce planning so you and your HR team can make the right business decisions. Imagine using data-driven insights to develop accurate forecasts, close hiring gaps, and adjust talent acquisition plans collaboratively based on costs today and into the future. Planful lets you collaborate with colleagues in finance to understand the value your employees bring to the table. And the best part, you can get started with Planful in just weeks with minimal help from IT. Plus, with Planful, you get an endless runway. Planful grows with you, no matter how fast or large your team scales. Ready to transform your HR strategy? Join over 1,500 organizations worldwide who trust Planful as their go-to workforce planning software at planful.com/heretics.
Here's a crazy stat. Between hybrid and frontline employees, about 80% don't typically work in an office. So it's no surprise that digitally engaging employees is the number one concern for CEOs as companies go hybrid. But as hybrid is quickly becoming the norm, it's easy for workplaces to start feeling a little less human. Yet delighting a digital workforce is possible, and it can even be, dare we say, fun. That's where Workvivo, Zoom's employee experience platform, comes in. If you've ever recoiled at the thought of a static intranet that looks like something you built in 1995 using MS Paint, have no fear. Workvivo is a dynamic, intuitive, accessible, and mobile-first tool. People actually like using it, which is why companies like Ryanair, Dollar General, Virgin, and more have rolled it out to hundreds of thousands of employees. Workvivo's activity feeds, spaces, shoutouts, and live streams, among other features, help elevate the employee experience like never before. The result? Dramatically better retention, productivity, and most importantly, connectedness. A greater sense of the belonging we all crave at work, whether we sit at a desk or drive a truck. Make Workvivo the digital heart of your organization and achieve limitless human connection. Head to workvivo.com to book a demo and make sure you tell them that Nolan and Kelly from HR Heretics sent you. So I want to spend more time on this because I couldn't agree more. I feel like interview training is done poorly everywhere. And the reason why is typically what it looks like. You show up for this hour-long session led by a recruiter who actually doesn't know the specifics of the job. And we give these very general principles on what we expect interviewing to look like, which more has to do with like, don't be an asshole, be on time, pay attention to the candidate, be a good person. Like,
Don't eat, don't ask them if they're pregnant. Yeah.
yeah. Please, like, let's not get sued. That's like general. It's like an interview training at most companies.
101 generic off the shelf. Yeah.
Totally. And then you get into the actual interview, and the whole point we forget is we want to get signal on the candidates such that we can then start predicting job performance.
Yeah. I think 2 points, right? We want to get signal and we want to give signal.
I strongly agree. So how do you then coach, get signal and give signal?
Yeah. So we're right now implementing an interviewer audit process, or I've rebranded it, interviewer coaching process, where our most believable interviewers are getting pulled to spend 1 to 2 hours a week reviewing our people who have not been interviewing as long and giving them feedback specifically on those 2 things. Did you conduct a thorough assessment, and does your scorecard accurately reflect the candidate's performance? And then 2, did you deliver a great candidate experience? Did you sell Garner well? Did you sell yourself well? Did you smile? Was the thing we have to remind our interviewers sometimes. And then we basically have just a scalable process where more and more people go from coachees to coaches, and we add more and more people into the company, and round we go.
Interesting. So it's like a little bit of like bar raisery-ish.
But at a little bit more asynchronously so we can scale it better.
Okay. When you say most believable interviewers, what does that mean?
Great question. It is basically interviewers that have been stamped by some combination of me, Nick, and our head of TA as already being good at those 2 things.
Okay. And so I would assume part of most believable actually means like this person gets signal on candidates. And so are you guys doing anything from like hey, we've interviewed this person, they've now joined the company, and then now we're tying it back to like what we saw in the interview? Because most companies just stop it. Now they're in the company. They're either a good performer, middle of the pack, or they suck. And then we don't do anything with that data as it relates to the interview process. Yeah.
So we absolutely are. We actually we're not what I would love, and we're not yet able to do because I have not yet sprung for the Tableau add-on to Greenhouse, is constantly aligning like which interviewers are most aligned to an offer going out, and then which interviewers are most aligned to high performance. We're not able to do that yet entirely, but what I did ask my team to do, and I just got the results of it, is run an experiment based on a hypothesis that my CEO and I shared, that the best signal for success at Garner, our best interview, and this is wild, is actually like a McKinsey style first year consultant interview of, for example, if you were the mayor of New York, would you outlaw Airbnb? Should human cloning be allowed? Those questions that really just test structured critical thinking. And as we analyzed all of our Greenhouse data and compared it to performance, and lo and behold, it's true. That is the most correlated interview to successful performance. And so now the only person who currently does that interview is Nick, and I am on a mission to get everyone else, a bunch of other people ready to do that interview.
So when I was at Google as a recruiting coordinator, we ran this major experiment around, we call them GCA interviews, so general cognitive ability. And it is exactly the interview that you're describing. And at one point, we had 8 people who only ran the same interview. So literally we're asking case questions all day long. And we tried to filter in, I mean, you can't filter in like as many candidates, Google was doing because it just didn't scale at that moment in time with 30,000 employees going to 60,000. But we did find the same thing that you found, which is for the most part, and it's not a perfect system, but if you run a structured case interview, that has the closest correlation to on-job performance, which honestly is like not the finding that I wanted to have, because it feels like really this is the best way that we can do it is with case interviews, but we found the same thing.
Yeah. And I'll also, I'll add on interviewing, all of our interviews are different. We don't really do any tell me about a time type of interviews. It is all because we're different in the way that we work. All of our interviews are meant to mimic and mirror the way that we work. So we do working sessions, case studies, like grapple with a discussion topic, have a culture feedback session, all things intended to basically mimic what it's like to work at Garner and see if this person would thrive in that environment.
So I have a strong belief that the future of interviewing is going to be much more simulative, such that like you get very specific about what work is actually like at your company. And then you try and simulate that throughout the entire process. It's still imperfect, but it's much better than, these hypothetical situational questions, which have more to do with pattern recognition of what other smart people have said, which could potentially just be a signal of a good interviewer versus a good employee. You said culture feedback. What does that mean?
So basically, we do an interview where we have a candid culture. We put a lot of emphasis in making sure that our candid culture is both direct and empathetic, because a lot of people are doing various forms of candor very badly, as you know, or it's just an excuse for the CEO to go around and telling people they're dumb. That's not us. That's not our version. So basically, in our culture interview, we test for mission alignment. We but we spend a lot of time on this piece of courageous communication that is a place where we're particularly bespoke. And so essentially we start with asking the candidate a tell me about a time question where they gave feedback to someone. And then we basically give them lots of opportunities to fail in their answers so that we can say like, hey, let me push you. That wasn't a great answer. I have feedback. I think that was a narrow learning and you could cut a much wider swath of change if you pushed yourself to ask why a few times. And then we also ask for feedback. And the reason why we do these things is because we are bespoke in the way that we do feedback. So if we did a tell me about a time, we're not even using the word feedback the same way. And so I think where you are bespoke, you can't do those types of questions. You have to test. You have to actually see how it works in practice.
Wow. How do you tell candidates that this is coming? Because I'm of two minds. One is if you prepare a candidate for this sort of interview, they can come like ready, like with the example. On the other one, you're thinking of like, well, like they should have something like pretty front of mind of when they experience this, because we want them to actually have done this in the past. And I think that sounds like a core competency to Garner. How do you guys think about prepping candidates for these sorts of interviews?
We tell them that most interviews are discussion and don't require a lot of prep, with the exception we do have like a deep case, more the simulation thing that you were like, more the exact work simulation type of interview that you were talking about. We ask them to read our values, and, candidates that read our values will either be like, yes, or like, and so already there's a little bit of self-selection there. And the interview is intended to be, is intended to be selective in terms of if people don't enjoy that, they won't enjoy working here.
Yeah. Okay. I love that. And then you had mentioned, you didn't use the word repellent, but I'll use that word. How does the repellent piece show up as part of the interview process of where you're trying to make sure, like, what are maybe it's said differently, what are the most distinct traits of Garner that either really get people excited or really push them away.
Yeah, it is like the two places where we're the most bespoke. And my two favorite things I also took away from Bridgewater, as it happens, incredibly high standards. So some people are like, my work is good. What's the problem? And we're like, your work's not excellent. That's the problem. And then the candor, some people just want the attaboys and attagirls and, others, and aren't comfortable in an environment where, you've been an executive for 20 years and a 22-year-old can question your thinking on something, and they're going to be just as bright as you are and have just as much right to question you as you have to question them. Some people don't like that.
Hey everyone, we'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Real talk, most talent leaders haven't yet cracked how to leverage AI for meaningful impact on their hiring processes and business goals. But the leaders who are effectively using AI to transform their recruiting team's efficiency and quality use Metaview. Metaview is the AI assistant for the interview process. Their AI records and transcribes hiring conversations, like intakes, interviews, and debriefs, then provides perfectly summarized notes of everything that was discussed. That means your people can focus on creating human connections with candidates during calls and save time on the busy work of cleaning up notes after every interview. But it's so much more than just a time saver, because perfect notes means perfect data. For every candidate and every pipeline, hiring teams can make confident, informed decisions, and talent leaders can finally take control of the interview process. Join forward-thinking talent leaders at high-performing organizations like Brex, HelloFresh, and Quora, and check out Metaview. Head over to metaview.ai/heretics to talk to one of Metaview's product experts, or get started for free. You'll be up, running, and AI-enabled in minutes.
I love that. So how does feedback actually show up then on a day-to-day basis for employees?
Yeah, so many ways. Let me take you through a day for me of feedback. I was actually, I will limit myself to yesterday. So yesterday, I started my day in my one-on-one with my CEO. We talked about a lot of things, but one, I gave him feedback on, I thought that he wasn't accurately representing our root cause analysis process and was causing it to seem more scary to people than what it really is, which is like incredibly supportive and uplifting and a way to learn. And so he was open-minded to that. We talked about a meeting he'd done recently, and he was going to go and like reassess how he had done in that meeting. And then we were going to come back and discuss what he could do better. Then he gave me feedback that he thought that he'd seen my reliability in my IC work slipping over the course of the last few months, which I did not agree with his examples. And we had a good debate, and we ended up having a meeting of the minds. And then later in the day, we had our promotion meeting, at the end of which our head of research, our head of data and science and research said, okay, Valentina, I've been in 2 of these now where we've promoted everyone. Like, are you holding a rubber stamping meeting? And I was like, a great question, Phil. And we all like had a great conversation as a team where I was able to explain how like all of the pre-work and the fact that the meeting exists is the reason why we promote everyone, because people are actually like doing the hard work in advance, so we don't have to do it in the room. But like, think about the benefits of those things, right? Like, if I hadn't given Nick that feedback, he might be going around scaring people when he's trying to uplift them. If Nick and I hadn't had that conversation, we'd be walking around with 2 very different pictures of my reliability, and I might be silently failing in his mind. And if Phil hadn't brought that thing out, like half the LC might be walking around thinking I'm wasting their time. Or better yet, what if I was wasting their time and they had actually won the day on that argument? Like, what a boon for me to get that. Yeah, it might be slightly painful in the moment, but man, is that a gift.
I love that so much. I mean, just for me personally, it resonates because I feel like my co-founder says this all the time. The difference between nice and kind is honesty.
Totally.
And so nice people lie to you all day. Kind people tell you the truth. And I think feedback has been weaponized, quite a bit. There's issues. And actually, maybe I'll ask you this question is, how do you solve the hierarchical feedback issue? Right. So it's one thing for you to receive feedback from Nick, who's your CEO. It's another thing for you to give feedback to Nick, and then, multiply that dozens of times throughout the hierarchy in the company. With the up can give down feedback, but down can't really give up feedback. How do you think about solving that problem?
We are pretty non-hierarchical. In fact, I'm seriously considering getting rid of titles right now. But the best way that we do it is by all of the leaders, A, demonstrating vulnerability, and B, modeling this behavior. So like we'll be in a management meeting, like, for example, with 2 new LC members. One of the older LC or longer tenured LC members like Phil or I will give Nick feedback live in the meeting. And so the new members of the team are like, oh, wow, I see. This is how it works and it's safe. And the most important thing is that Nick receives, and we all receive feedback with gratitude. We all reward voice, right? If you reward voice, regardless of what it's saying, people will talk. And then you can determine the merit of the ideas, later. But first you reward the voice.
That's a great tactic. I love that. Talk to me about like performance reviews. Do you guys do performance reviews? And how does it show? Like, there's one thing about real-time feedback, which is, hey, I'm being honest with you today, which I think is absolutely necessary. That's where most companies go wrong. But then there's like this, okay, time to like take a step back and like really think about if you're applying those things that we're talking about on a daily basis and what I want to see you work on into the future. Performance reviews as part of our current macro are getting shit on. People hate them. They are ineffective. They're a waste of time. It feels like, the paper pushing bureaucracy of HR is just stacking more papers on your desk of shit to do. How do you guys think about that?
So I think we're in a transition period from when I joined, which was a twice a year full-fledged review period, which, halted the business for 4 months out of the year, or certainly the people team, to a more continuous process where people get feedback regularly after projects. And then once a year, we do the step back on performance. The reasons we do that are twofold. And I think this is the reason why many companies retain the review. One, we want good, strong, triangulated data for merit-based pay and bonuses. And then 2, so we want people to pause and think really hard for, a couple of weeks to make sure that we are compensating people fairly and rewarding people fairly. And then we're a data-driven company. And so we have a rating scale, from 1 to 5. We crave that data about how employees are performing. And so we know that it's inherently biased. We try to make it as accurate as possible, but we do find that it gives us a good directional read on how different leaders are managing.
Do you force a curve on that rating scale?
We naturally, as a high-performing company, have, kind of a, power law curve, and that I haven't had to force that. That is just happening.
How is calibration happening for those levels?
Where there are a lot of incumbents, the individual, like for example, engineering is a large team. The individual leader of that team will hold a calibration across their department. So actually all of R&D calibrates together. And then we hold an LC calibration where essentially Nick and my team and I look across everything, make sure that it makes sense, and then pull in different LC members where we have questions. We will likely move into a fuller calibration / succession. I don't want to use the word succession because it's not really what I mean, but talent development, let's say, model for our most senior talent. But I don't like the traditional ways of doing that. So I still haven't figured out exactly what I'm going to invent there.
I agree. I think there's a big problem to be solved in this area that nobody has actually solved very well. But it sounds like you guys are doing the best practices as they are today.
We're trying. I mean, we're making up
our own best. Let's shift into manager training.
Sure.
So when you and I jammed in our, virtual Zoom coffee chat, you had told me this interesting anecdote around manager training and your unique approach to that. Can you tell our audience a little bit about how you guys think about manager training?
So, there's all this talk about the new L&D and how the classroom is dead and how it's all about gamification and just in time. And I agree with a lot of that, but I also think on the classroom is dead part is pretty seriously misguided, unless you happen to be a company that has an army of phenomenal coaches, in which case you are the company that has all the phenomenal coaches in the world because there's only a handful of them, or maybe a few handfuls of them. And so I believe that the classroom is a way to scale a great coach. Not that I'm putting myself in the handful of world-class coaches, to be clear, but I deliver all the teaching myself, and none of it is didactic. We don't do any didactic in the classroom. All the basics we do via written trainings, very Garner specific, created by my team. Like, here's an outline of how to manage poor performance. My people are very smart. They don't need to stand in a room where I'm standing in front of them and listen to me explain that. So everything that is basic is outlined in a searchable way. And it's just like intended to take the lift off of the thinking about the basic stuff. Hopefully soon that'll be automated, and like we'll have a little AI chatbot that will help you figure out how to think through your basics on management questions. But the hard stuff, the really hard stuff, I don't think you can teach hard concepts unless you make it hard to teach them. And I don't think that like you have to really grapple with like, how do I trade off a big KPI move versus this hole in my processes and ecosystem? A gamified puzzle is not going to teach you how to do that. And so what we do in the classroom is we bring hard business problems, smart people together, and they try to solve these hard business problems. And I design the business problems not to have a solution, because there's no right answer, but to drive home certain principles and tenets that they uncover themselves by solving the business problems. And I'm like, hey, what principles did you use? And they're like, well, we realized that in org design, you can actually determine how much IC time a manager has by how senior their reports are and how many they have. I just found a great new way to design jobs. Perfect.
All right, so let me restate some of this. So I'm not very smart. So I think what didactic means is like I'm like standing in front of the classroom and I'm like telling you what you should do, lecturing. Okay, great. So instead of the traditional lecture process, you do a real world simulation and you present.
Yeah, we write the lecture down, let them read it, and then we do a real world simulation.
Okay. And what are examples of the real world simulation that's like what would be like a problem statement? And then like, do they pair off, or is it like one person comes up with you and everyone watch it? What is that like?
Yep. So I'll give you a recent one. It was basically, we were teaching prioritization. And the case was, welcome to Garner. You're the new head of marketing. Here is a list of priorities and where they stand from your predecessor, which was like a 3-page list of red, amber, green nonsense. Here's your current org chart. And here's an email from the CEO about an engagement marketing problem that he thinks is going on. What do you do? And basically what the group came up with, then they break off into small groups, and I teach 2 courses, a manager's course and then a manager of managers course, the second of which is a little more advanced. They break off. The best groups came back with, there's no KPIs here. So the first thing I would do is figure out, like, what am I actually going after? There's way too much on this list. And so I've driven home now the principle of you must form your KPIs and know what you're going after first. There's too much on this list. I've driven home the principle of we don't peanut butter at Garner. We crush 2 to 3 things with overwhelming force. The org design is a mess. So that allows me to throw some org design tenets in there. And that's kind of how it goes. And then at the end, I'm like, here are the insights you all came up with. And so far, each time the case led to the exact insights that I wanted it to, but they got them on their own.
That's so cool. So I just have to like get into this stuff, because when I hear new things, I'm like, all right, tell me how you do it, because I want to think about this for myself. So how long is each case?
So the courses are each in classroom learning is 90 minutes. Each case, depending on whether we do 2 or 3, each case in total, between when I give it to them, their time to solve it, and then our time to talk about it, is typically like 45 minutes, and we'll do 2.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And are you doing these in person, or are you doing these over Zoom?
I'm doing them virtually over Zoom.
Okay. Yeah. You got to make hybrid work.
Yeah. And they break into groups, and then I go through the breakout groups. We make sure that the in-person people are in a Zoom room where I can jump in there. And so I can help poke and direct a little bit, but not much. Our people are smart.
Wow. It just leads me to the question that goes to my mind, which is, okay, one of the hardest things that managers never practice is terminating an employee. Do you all practice that?
Yes, we just finished designing your function and I'm about to go into managing your people. But yeah, difficult performance situations will definitely be a case that we'll do.
It's so wild to me that the first time somebody actually goes through that experience from the manager, they made the decision, now they've decided to terminate an employee and deliver that to somebody, is literally when they're in the room delivering that to somebody.
Yeah, no, that's wild. Well, that would never happen at any of my companies because I make sure that my HRBPs are thoughtful or my people partners are thoughtful. And particularly since I've always had a lot of new managers that they just say, hey, give me your talk track and let's practice.
Yeah. I do think though that there's an aspect of truly simulation, especially with your peers, that I think could be insanely beneficial for just all of these hard things that we have to do in management every single day.
Yeah, identifying poor performance. I mean, in a high feedback culture, drawing the line from when I'm giving feedback to invest in your long-term future at Garner to boop, I'm giving feedback because I'm no longer sure you have a long-term future at Garner. If you don't do that well, everyone's confused. So yes, very important.
Valentina, this was so much fun. I think we covered about 3.5 hours worth of content in 45 minutes. I told you this before we started. One of the things I love about you is your very high content to word ratio. And so I'm so excited for our audience to get access to this episode. Thank you for taking us to school today.
This has been so much fun. I've enjoyed it a ton. Thank you.
HR Heretics is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Econ 102, Moment of Zen, and Turpentine VC. Subscribe, 5 stars, share it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, all the things.